Good morning, everyone. Good morning to the second day of Next Innovation Week with a very interesting session, and actually our first patient engagement session with the title Advisory Boards Develop the Right Toolkit for the Modern Age. I have four amazing speakers and even more amazing VC today, and you will definitely learn some of very interesting insights related to this particular topic. Just for your information, in total, at the Next Innovation Week, we have more than 1,500 people, more than 40 speakers within 5 days, and in total 10 sessions, or this is actually the third session in total. And now I would like to pass the stage to Gabriela. Gabriela, the stage is yours, and really looking forward to this interesting discussion.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel. We're thrilled to have you. And let's just jump right in. I think what we'll do first is we'll have each of our panelists introduce themselves and answer the question, what are the key components of a toolkit for advisory boards in the modern age? What are the key components of a toolkit for advisory boards in the modern age? Daniel, can I ask you to begin just with an introduction and an answer to that question?
Yes, sure. Daniel de Schrijver. I am part of the patient engagement leadership team of Johnson & Johnson, and I lead specifically our network of patient engagement and advocacy leads in the European region. Yes, well, I think we are using these tools, one of the basic tools, if we want to continue patient engagement, which we will, and we need to continue with ad boards. It's needed that we start using all the digital tools like Zoom and other webinars, methods to be sure that we can continue to have a dialogue with patients. So for me, those basic tools are the fundament of continuous engagement.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. How about Lasse? Would you introduce yourself and give us your response?
Yes, absolutely. I'm super excited to be here. So I'm Lasse Jacobsen. I sit in Leo Pharma. I sit in the patient engagement team there, and also we, as Daniel said, we support the whole value chain of ensuring that we get patient insights into all parts of our, you could say, key functions, and also not only we hear them, but we also implement the patient voice. And I would say to your question, I agree with Daniel, software is super important these days during COVID-19, obviously, but I would maybe say that for the standalone, I would be very clear on a component like in the planning and preparation phase on be very clear on purpose, format, frequency, requirements. In that way, you are super transparent. I think from experience, this leads to the best possible outcome for all involved, but of course, first and foremost for the people living with a chronic disease or their caregivers. So that would be my immediate take.
That's great. Thank you so much. Felix, over to you. Oh, you're on mute, Felix.
Thanks very much.
No problem.
I'm Felix Jackson. I'm founder and medical director of MedDigital and MedCrowd. We run a lot of digital advisory boards, and we find that a mix of technology really helps. So getting people in face-to-face and combining that with virtual sessions like this one, and also text-based ones. And that combination is incredibly powerful. Obviously, the face-to-face ones are challenging at the moment, but hopefully, that'll restart or there'll be opportunities for them in the future.
Great, wonderful. And Mark.
Yeah, hello, and thank you. Thanks, Gabriela, and thanks, Dario, for this opportunity. So Mark Johnson, work at GlaxoSmithKline for digital engagements, which is quite a broad term, but that's for external in the scientific space, so work in medical affairs. In terms of key components for me, I'm very focused on the how. So engagement, trust, and I suppose facilitation being those key three things to get the best success. So how do you set them up? How do you engage the experts, the HCPs, the nurses, whoever's taking part in that board? But how do you build that level of trust? So without that trust, you're not getting the best place for being able to share opinions and information. And then obviously facilitation. You can sort of leave an empty room and no one's really talking. So how do you keep that ongoing engagement? You need that facilitation. So just a few key things for components. And I think importantly, in the current climate just now, is really understanding the reason why. There's a lot of pressure obviously on digital, and I think it's too easy for us to look at digital as a replacement for face-to-face. I think Felix and a couple of panelists mentioned something there. It is part of it, is just a channel. And if we look at it as a replacement, that's the wrong way of looking at it. So very much looking at it for the benefits that digital brings.
That's great. Thank you so much. So Daniel, I'd love to explore a little bit further two things. One, how you differentiate between patient advocates and patients at large, just so we can get clear on who are we talking about. And then secondly, how do you imagine research being done by and through patient groups? I know this is something you've thought a lot about, and we'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so basically, if we want to make a definition of the differentiation, we can go to Upati, the online tools. They have a sort of framework where they really explain what is the difference between a patient, a person who can speak about the condition he is living or she is living with, and then the more expert patient who is representing a group of patients with a similar condition, or who has an expertise in clinical trials, for example, by experience. So how can I make good and let's say professional remarks on protocol design, or who is a patient expert who knows how the healthcare system works. So I think there is a differentiation that's obvious, and you do need different interactions depending on what you're looking for. I think in order to understand what is your perfect solution, you will have to work with patients at large and get information from people living with a condition so that they can explain you what is their journey from the first symptoms to diagnosis to getting treated. That's important because, of course, you want to differentiate. You want to have an impact on their life. You want to have an impact on their health. So it's important to know where to play. But then if you want to have the perfect protocol, you potentially also need some better insights, more expertise on what the impact of a clinical trial will be on people's life. And then at the end, you would again go back to patients at large because you need real world evidence and you need to make sure that people speak from what their experience is in their daily life. And the digital tools today, Mark and Felix, I don't need to go into that, but there's plenty of it. So basically, we're probably underusing all of these. So for me, that is a big differentiator. And then, of course, the way you interact with them and even the way you can get in touch with them is different. I still feel that there is a huge role for patient advocacy and patient organization. And I think this role is actually will increase in the future because I think they represent and they should represent a huge number of patients, but they should also be able to form platforms and to engage with the people who are, let's say, behind them, the people they represent. I think it would be nice if there would be communities of patients, the organization being the representation, but communities where they can tap into, where they can ask patients at large that somehow connect to this patient advocacy group, what their opinion is, what their daily problems are. So I think the demands on patient input will be higher because the whole industry has understood, and even payers have understood, that it's the patient himself or herself who should decide on the quality of the healthcare. So the more that we're going to ask them, the more there will be demands, and the more there is demands, the more there is a need for organization. So I think the patient organization can play a fantastic role also in research, because we're also looking at remote trials here on the industry side. But if you want to, let's say, have registries or surveys, I think a lot of it could be done by patient organizations. I think there is more trust, obviously, because if you're a patient and you're giving your data to a peer, sounds even better than to give it to an unknown organization. So I think there is an opportunity there, but that is still, I think, vastly untapped. So we're talking here changes of an environment, and we're in the initial changes. We're not there yet, but I believe that again, I come back to what I said in the beginning: a patient as an organized group, their role will be bigger in the future.
Mm-hmm. We mentioned earlier in our introduction about the combination of in-person, digital, text-based tools. Lasse, can I ask you, you've talked a little bit about sometimes doing text-based communications before you have a group of patients sit down around a table. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how you think about that blended approach?
Yes, absolutely, Gabriela, and I want to say I agree to many of the points that Daniel made in the sort of the build-up. But I would say, you know, it is absolutely vital, especially these days, the last 6-7 months, right? Because we've really changed the you could say the manner of how we do our advisory boards, and that leaves your question, you could say, in a place where it's super relevant, because now we are left with the text-based communication due to the COVID-19 situation. And many, of course, feared, so will we actually be able to be as productive and ensure as much insights as we are used to the different advisory boards and workshops and insight sessions we do with patient and patient groups? And the answer is yes. Luckily, I mean, through, as we said, through the different channels that we have, but also through extremely well preparation, and that's where the text-based comes in. So of course, through different emails, sessions, on being very clear on in the planning phase, so defining the clear purpose, mission, the outcome with a given advisory board session in itself, defining the group, doing the correct introduction so everybody feels very comfortable. All are actually done online now. On top of that, there is an element of also administrative work here. I mean, we have to recognize contracts, transparency, expectation setting, pre-read material, even down to the simple things like making sure that you help out with the different software and the way it's used, because we forget sometimes that we sit in front of the computer all day, but not necessarily all the patient boards and the members of our advisory boards do the same. So you have to be, you know, really, you could say, setting the stage and be really strong in your planning phase here, I would say. So that leaves us with that we have used, obviously, the text-based communication a lot and in a very clear manner, you could say, and everything from the pre-reads, from the introductions, from maybe a preparation intro call to a channel like this one or Teams or similar, is absolutely vital before you go into the actual session itself. Some initial thoughts there, but also moving ahead of this, not only is it the planning phase that we are left with in a communication that is virtual, that's online, that's text-based, it's also during our execution, as you know, now, especially these days. And here it is really essential that you have a very clear structure, but also many had feared before that we will miss out on this personal interaction. So it's vital that you have your even down to the smallest tools, like your webcam is on, it's being more personalized, you really capture the insights. And then to do that in a proper and a really valuable way for all parties, you have to have a very strong facilitator, obviously, so a leader of your advisory board. So I would say those are some of my considerations in terms of the execution and how we use the text-based communication there. But also in the last phase I want to bring up is after the meeting. Here it's absolutely vital that you also follow up in a proper manner, meaning that yes, you can do your evaluation short term, get some kind of quantification on how it went. However, from a qualitative perspective, you need to capture that text-based feedback in order for you to get better and more efficient in capturing those insights, especially when it comes to implementation. Because we in pharma, we all know that we can receive a lot of fantastic insights that would actually help. But on the other hand, we are also, you could say, we have to be very much aware of the authorities, how much we can actually implement, And in that sense, you need to be super clear on what are we actually taking of this advice that a person shared from, to Daniel's point, their personal disease journey, their story, and how much can we actually implement. So it's about being very clear on that as well afterwards. And then be clear on the next steps, and also be transparent around if it's not all insights that you have gotten that you can actually implement. Be very clear on that as well. That will create a mutual respect, I think, and a sustainable relation.
So through all the way to follow through and follow up seems like a really important component to text-based communications and really all communications with patients and patient groups. So we have a question. We have a question in the chat, and I want to encourage all of our participants to please send your questions in. We love to get them. Daniel, for you, can you give a rough estimate of how much % of your engagements are with patient experts, patient groups, or non-affiliated, non-expert patients?
That's a hard one. I would think if you look at the engagement on a permanent basis in a dialogue format, obviously the majority is with organized patient representatives, because that's where we, I think, get an ongoing dialogue. Obviously, throughout many years, you look at what you're trying to achieve in your early development. You're going to research. You're having solutions that's being used, and then you look at unmet needs and how can you further tackle these unmet needs. So I think majority potentially is there quantitatively. I know we have, for example, 12,500 patients who looked at protocols, so who gave input into protocols out of 32 countries, so basically the whole world. Those are, of course, experts in a way. There must have been represented or representatives from organized groups. If I look at how many people we do survey or ask input as on their patient journey, it's probably a high quantity too. So I don't know the percentage, I will admit, because I never calculated it. But those are, of course, that you go once, you get their input, you get feedback, but it may not be the same once you're going back to the next time, contrary to patients who are in an organized group. So I would think majority goes to organized groups, but the percentage, exact percentage, I'm sorry for not being able to give that. Potentially, I think we never measured that either.
Not at all. Thank you for describing the mix. Lasse, it looked like you had a thought to add to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say there's an element of, first of all, considering patients as experts throughout any kind of, you could say, knowledge sharing, what we call tier levels. So even an expert, even a patient, is an expert in their own right, meaning that they can represent themselves and tell us their story. And that would sometimes refer to a more, you could say, a layman input. However, we all know, especially in pharma, that input is especially vital when it comes to, for example, when we look at different clinical operation phases and what we need there in order for us to actually make the most precise medicines in the end.
Great. Felix, let's come over to you for a minute if we could. We've talked a lot about this blended approach, and you have a particular expertise in text-based advisories, as well as others. Can you talk a little bit about the benefits of text-based advisories and maybe even the benefits of text-based advisories over in-person advisory boards?
Yeah, so we've developed MedCrowd, which is instant messaging technology for health and care, which we're using to do digital advisory boards with life science companies. We've got lots running at the moment. They're live. We've been running them, huge increase in demand over the pandemic situation as people are having to cancel their face-to-face advisory boards. I think there's a few things that are really important. I think, building on what Lasse said, that it's really important to keep these technologies simple. If you have to train people on them and teach them how to use it, they don't work. So we developed MedCrowd with an instant messaging style interaction, just like WhatsApp, really, very similar, which means people can pick it up very quickly. It's very familiar. I think that's really important. So they can just get in. And so we often don't even do a face-to-face or a virtual video advisory board before we just get started. People can just get in, they just like a WhatsApp group, they can just chat and start giving insight, which gets them set up and running very, very quickly. And that's an advantage, because if you want to get something in somebody's diary, sometimes you have to spend a couple of months waiting until you can find time for 10 people to come, even for a video conference at the same time. So it means you can get them running very quickly. I think our fastest one we got up and running was within a week. So you can get them running fast with very little training, because the format is familiar. They just sign up and it's a messaging format. But the big advantage I'm seeing is around the insights you get. I think people are much more comfortable to really kind of say what they think. You know, when they're sitting in a room with the top prof in the world sitting there staring at them, you know, it can be quite daunting. So what they want to do is be able to you know, think it through, do a bit of research, maybe look at some research papers, and then come back with an answer they've thought about, they've crafted. And you often see they come in, they visit the question one day, and then a couple of days later their response arrives, and it's obvious they've gone away, they've thought about it, they've researched it, and they can then give a really, really high quality answer. So I now believe that you actually get better answers from text-based advisory boards than you do for synchronous face-to-face or virtual advisory boards, because people have time to research and consider their answer. And sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes you're just like asking for a gut reaction, in which case that, you know, you can do them synchronously. But I think that's a really important thing. Lasse, you were going to say?
No, it's just supporting a comment, Felix. I completely agree. However, there's also the flip side to the preparation element, because sometimes you capture questions you didn't think you had in this you could say here and now live session throughout some discussions. So I mean, I completely agree, because a lot of the elements we are discussing need some kind of preparation, but sometimes key elements and key insights are also found in the here and now moment when we take up certain discussions on, especially from the patient perspective and their journey. I think that's sort of the other side to it. So that's just a comment to that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we're seeing now more and more you get really good conversations in the text-based format, because it's kind of messaging that people are doing all the time with WhatsApp. Now they're familiar with it. Over the last few years, we've seen that change. You know, you do get that interaction. I mean, sometimes if you ask a very direct question, what do you do with your medicine or with your patient? You know, you get a very direct answer back. But if you ask these big questions like, you know, what do you think? How is this clinical research going to change, you know, the field of oncology? You know, you get a very good discussion and the interaction between participants. And I guess the last thing, just to follow up on the last big advantage I see with the text-based advisory boards is the immediacy of them. So, I mean, I have an example I've shared that is that we had a client who had some marketing messages they needed to check with their advisory board, and we had a digital advisory board running alongside their kind of normal activities, all set up and ready to go. And so on Friday morning they had a meeting. They had the new kind of advertising claims that they're ready to test. So we wrote it up as a question. We got the medic to approve it. We put them live kind of about 4 p.m. on Friday afternoon. The 10 oncologists answered over the weekend, and on Monday morning, our scientific advisor came in and wrote up the 3 or 4 slides that kind of captured the insight we got from those 10 advisors over the weekend, and they sent it to the client by 10 o'clock on Monday morning. So their very next team meeting, they had the answers, and they changed their mind. They decided to go with a different strapline based on the feedback. And that's very difficult to do with virtual and face-to-face. So that immediacy in that way of getting little bite-sized nuggets of insight as you go along. So it becomes very actionable because you're getting it as you make decisions during your day-to-day work. And that for me is a major shift in the way that we're collecting insight, because we're discovering it as we go along. But I did want to say that we still do face-to-face. They're brilliant for building community, getting people to know each other, to, you know, hang out. It's nothing like, you know, having dinner after an advisory board, that kind of thing, to build relationships, which I think is key. And virtual is really good, particularly in the current environment. I'll go to Mark and say, I'll just finish this comment.
No, go for it, Felix. Go on.
Oh, I think he might have frozen.
Yes.
But I was just gonna jump in to say I completely agree. And actually, I like the way Felix was talking about the I suppose, the attendees to an advisory board having more time to give an informed response. But Lasse, how you talked about actually from even facilitating or running that, it's actually giving you more time. So time is great in that aspect. We're also talking about the speed of response. I think a key thing for me is also the sort of wide variety of thinking or diversity, because in a face-to-face, yes, we can do logistics, you can get people to travel, but they tend to be run sort of more in time zones or regions, whereas in a digital sense that is asynchronous, you can have people in very different time zones, in very different languages, in their own time, then coming in and sharing that sort of info. And so you do get that wider variety of input into the discussion as well.
And Mark, can you talk a little bit about this last comment that Felix was making about the value of being able to build community? I think you've had some luck building trust in a digital environment. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that so that it's not only in the in-person environment that we can build trust, but there actually are ways digitally as well? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, happy to. I think, traditionally advisory boards have sort of been that one-off. You organise it, and it does take a long time to organise and try and get the schedules for everyone's diaries and plan it and get that face-to-face. And a lot of effort goes into that from both the people organising and the panellists. But it does tend to be that one-off, or you're wanting, you've got your objective, your scientific unmet need. And if that objective is met, then great. But I think what digital brings and what we're seeing as well, as we talked about, this time aspect. So it allows you and enables you to connect and collaborate over a longer period. So it's not always in the moment. Now, we're not saying in the moment, it's not replacing, absolutely in the moment is great. And I think what it is bringing just new channels. And if digital is looked at that way, as bringing extra stuff to the table of what we can do, you can then start to build up a bit more of a relationship. And that's important because I think you talked about the trust and transparency with patients. And I think, whether it's a digital advisory board for sort of scientists and healthcare professionals, whether it's patients, those are key. I think the drivers sometimes may be slightly different. I think for a healthcare professional, they're very keen to want to share their knowledge and advice. They're experts. They want to be asked for that, and also network and speak with people. So therefore, sometimes a face-to-face seems as a bit more of a driver that way. I think for the patients, and as it was sort of referred to, it's personal information. So the privacy aspect becomes even more a sort of a driver. So actually, I think the digital sense gives much better solutions for that, but it is the ongoing bit. And I think very important, as the other panelists said, that sort of follow-up. And if you do have more questions, to go back in. Yes, we've got to follow governance. We've got to make sure there is still a clear objective or still unknown that we're trying to meet. But having that continuous engagement is absolutely positive.
And Mark, do you think that there are insights that can't be drawn from a digital engagement in the way that you're describing? Is there a limit to the things you can ask about, or is it actually limitless?
Or insights that you can't get? Oh, I don't know about that. I think there's different models in digital, and I think it's important to understand why. What the objective is, and it's really tough at the moment. I think with the pandemic, and Daniel talked about that we should be doing more with digital, and I couldn't agree more. I've been shouting from the hilltop for this for years, and then suddenly the pandemic comes around, and if I may take a positive, the demand in digital has gone through the ceiling in that sense. But you still have to know why. If it is somebody just replacing a face-to-face, then we've got to work and sort of understand some of the benefits in that sense. So, but I suppose in terms of the sort of insights and what you can get, if you understand the objective and you can ask and use the right model, it may be that it's a face-to-face. It may be that it's a couple of virtual meetings like we're doing now, and you've got more talking heads and you can have a bit more discussion. maybe it is more text-based. So I think all of those options give you different ways of hitting the objective, hopefully get different variety of thought and different insights. Go on, Daniel.
No, I'm going to repeat exactly, Mark. You've been, and your title shows that you're closer to the digital than I am, but definitely yes. We all been shouting that for years, and now suddenly, thanks to the pandemic, I have to say that, remote doctor visits are possible. Right? They have always said it's impossible, and now patients with immunological diseases or oncology, they don't want to go to the doctor. And okay, yes, fine. Now it's suddenly possible. But I also think, and I'm coming back to that trust, I think you can ask everything, you can get everything, but people need to know why. And if indeed we are getting towards finally a healthcare system that says the patient experience is the measure of the quality of the healthcare system, and it's beyond the industry here, then of course you as an individual sharing your data becomes constructive to that purpose. And then theoretically, again, theoretically, you could be okay to share everything, as long as you know how is it going to be used, who is using it, and what is the final purpose. If the final purpose is indeed my own well-being is the measure of the healthcare system, we should be all happy. Because it will mean less waste, a more sustainable healthcare, basically. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet because we need to adjust, and everybody needs to say, okay, that's indeed what we're aiming at. Big discussion on who owns data, so we're not even going there, because then it's another Dario. You can set up another next pharma webinar on that one. But so in my opinion, we could theoretically ask everything, but we need to make sure that people understand what's the purpose.
So this was a question, Felix, that came up a little bit spawned by your comments about, are there types of questions or insights that cannot be gathered via text-based or digital advisory boards? So love to hear your thoughts on that, and then we'll come to Lasse.
Thanks. I'm not seeing much really. I mean, you know, anything you can ask in voice, you can you know, do in a digital or virtual or even face-to-face ad board. I guess the stuff you need to be careful about is the really, really secure stuff. I mean, I remember being part of an advisory board where it was shareholder sensitive information, the kind of financial data that changes share price. And then we had people in a room and any materials were shown, they took it away and shredded them afterwards. People were not allowed to be in recording or cameras, that kind of thing. And there are circumstances we have super, super sensitive and critical data. And I can imagine in the patient environment, if it's super personal, really personal data. But having said that, I mean, we're working with a company that works with people who are victims of domestic abuse. So, you know, you can be in a very, you know, personal situation and still work digitally. So for me, it's that corporate kind of confidential data. It's the only thing where you probably don't want it shared on a screen where somebody could have a camera set up in the background and be filming the whole thing and you wouldn't know. But even in those circumstances, if somebody wants to get a recording of it, they can. You know, even if it's face to face, you know, they can come in with a tiny little microphone and walk away with that. And they can walk out. We had a guy who we stopped using a long time ago when I was working actually in GlaxoSmithKline as an HIV medic, who we knew every time he left the advisory board was on the phone to the competitor and would tell them everything he asked and everything we went through. And we you know, struggled to work with him because he was not, you know, abiding by the rules in his contract. So there's, you know, you do need to be careful, but that's rare. And I think people have smartened up. They realize that kind of behavior is not appropriate for these kind of advisory boards. And, you know, it's a very, very slim minority of people who act like that. But those are the only ones where I'd get them in a room. You know, there's a couple of occasions to get them in a room so you can kind of just be a bit more close to them. But I find actually with people you trust, you can run a digital advisory board very, very effectively.
Great. Lasse, let's come over to you and then we'll come back to you, Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, Felix brought it up. I mean, and also Daniel, I think absolutely agree. It is, I would say, the last 6-7 months has shown us how efficient and productive things can really be in this setting. Absolutely. And then I was actually going to bring up what Felix already talked about. So, however, it is super important from a compliance, from a legal, from an ethical perspective that you have your, you could say, framework in place. So being very clear on contracts and transparency there. That's one element. And then when you ask, so what can't you do? Like what what's the difference actually? I would say, Felix, you brought it up earlier, the social element of getting to know each other when you are building up, as many of us are in this patient engagement, patient affairs function. We are building relations, we are building panels. It's very, very much based on trust. And there sometimes it is, you could say, more constructive and sustainable if you can get in the room together, have these small conversations, so you really get to know the person mutually, you could say. And that's maybe some of the elements. However, I would say it has surprised me positively using virtual settings like this, that you can actually do somewhat of the same, but I would still say that is what I'm missing more of, absolutely.
Mark, you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to come. I suppose when the term insight for me as well is something to just be a little bit cautious of, because I think insights can come from anywhere in any discussion at any point, and it's often, we do these advisory boards with an objective in mind to solicit information, feedback, and thoughts to meet that objective. Anything that sort of comes out of that that was unknown or not fully understood, then I sort of see as an insight. So there is I think that it's important that you do take time afterwards to analyze the data and responses, as much as in the moment, and listen, and then often how you can derive those sort of insights from that. But there's, I think, a sort of behavior sense, and Lasse talked about the social element there, in terms of if there's a discussion and there's trust, and I feel there's sometimes it seems easier to get that in a face-to-face setting, but I think that's because we're used to it and the type of people that are connecting. But in digital, you can get that trust in different ways and set up and still get that nice discussion. And often it's that discussion where you get those insights. It's, when we're in the office and, we talk about we're all missing it at the moment, that social interaction of sort of going for a coffee or in the lift and talking to people. And for me, those are the sort of insights that you get on a daily basis of what's happening within the company or what's going on in the industry.
I also think, Mark, there is something which, of course, we're not starting from scratch, and that's also different. If you start a relationship with people, and you have to start it from zero digitally, it's different than if you already know the people, you have been in contact with them, and then the only thing that has changed is the tool has changed. We can't meet, but we'll do it virtually. It's also a big difference. I think the uphill battle to start to build confidence when from scratch in digital, I think, is a bit higher. Takes a little bit more time potentially than if you already know the people, you have been working with them, and you just end to do it by Zoom or whatever, not making advertising here for Zoom, by any other digital means, fine. I mean, that's, I think, also a difference.
Felix, talk a little bit about that, about starting from scratch and building trust from scratch where you don't have history, because I think that's a barrier that we all have to get over in our own minds in order to be able to operate in this digital environment. So thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, it's a great problem to consider. But actually, I think it happens the other way around often. You hang out with somebody digitally. You maybe follow them on Twitter, you interact with them on Twitter, you like their tweets, you share your content, they respond, you get to know them, you're interested in what they're talking about, the place they're going, all that kind of stuff. They're often professional people on Twitter, you really value their input. And then a year or two later, you meet them at a conference, and you're starting from somewhere really special. You get that moment of, hey, you're Partha Kar, for example, who's a diabetologist I followed for a couple of years, and I met him at a conference, and it was just like, wow, we immediately became friends because we knew each other from Twitter. And so you get that as well from advisory boards. You hang out in an advisory board, you participate, you get to know somebody, and then you meet, let's say, in a year's time at the next conference or at a face-to-face advisory board, and you can connect. But it does need consideration, because you do need to make sure people have that, try and build that into the system. You need to do introductions. People need to complete their profiles, or you share. We sometimes share a preliminary report, which has basically got the kind of introduction for the report in it with the participants in the kind of opening video conference. So they can see all their bios and photos and everything in a nice little PowerPoint. And that just helps them get to know each other and start from somewhere. And then if you can, that's why we often do video conferences or face-to-face, where people just introduce themselves, they hang out, they do what we're doing now, they chat about stuff, and they get the kind of visual cues about each other. They can listen to people's accents and understand where people come from and their background and stuff in 1,000 ways that our bodies are programmed, our brains are programmed to pick up on people. And that can really help just gel that and bring in what we think of as a sense of community. So people perceive themselves as a group and then they work together. And we've now got one of these advisory boards going into its 5th year, and they've signed off for another 2 years. So, you know, and the group's evolved over time. It's not exactly the same people, but it's the core of it is the same. And you can see that these relationships go on, and they're incredibly powerful because you can now drop something into that group and you get a phenomenal answer because they've been on the journey with the client for years and they really understand it.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Mark, you look like you had a reaction.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think it's, you know, it starts right from the beginning, and every step and every interaction helps to create that level of trust. And, you know, from doing it in this digital setting, I mean, even if you take sort of us as a group, and not to give too much away from behind the scenes, and you know, but Dario's communications at the outset, and Gabriella, you're in terms of, you know, we're focusing on a familiar topic, but then this other thing that this pandemic has brought us as well is the access through video cams into all of our homes, into all of our home environments, and so that's a sense of vulnerability, it's a sense of trust that we're giving to each and every one already. And then it's just you find different information, and I won't go into, you know, but how we had a discussion just 5 minutes into coming into this, you know, what rooms we're sort of based in or where we're at, and all those different things. You get those icebreakers or different things to talk about. It does help to create those levels of trust, and it doesn't have to always be really positive. Just if it does go wrong, or if there is sort of negative experiences, it's how you react to those to then continue to create that into a positive sense going forward, and continuing to build that trust. So it's all very key around the communications, I think.
Daniel, any cautions you'd have about taking what Felix and Mark are talking about in the HCP context and applying it to patients?
You mean maybe the data and the confidentiality that Felix talked about? I think again, it's a trust issue. When patients work with you, they know why they're doing that, and I think I have not experienced any problems with sharing a lot of information on ongoing clinical trials and research. I come from the HIV environment, so this practice is old school. We did it already in the early 2000s, and we've been very, very far beyond, let's say, what would be normally be shared, because it was in a closed environment. There was a confidentiality agreement, and we all know, and they all know, this is something that is key for the business. It's sensitive, but it's also key that they can then at that time give input and change that trajectory, making it better for them. Never had any issues, and I believe there is no reason to believe that we would have issues. I think basically, potentially even less, and I'm going to be saying something that probably nobody likes, but patients are not in there for the money. And I think sometimes with HCPs, people become self-confident and self-fulfillment, and it becomes a business on its own. I don't think you have that with patients. So I would have a higher trust at 0 level for that reason.
To build on that, we found that often the best participants are nurses, pharmacists, and patients, because they're not often asked to be part of an advisory board. So for them, it's a real special thing. You know, they take it very seriously. They really contribute to a very high level. Whereas the doctor that's done 1,000 advisory board, it's just another pharma advisory board, and they just kind of churn out the same old answers. And sometimes going to a different group, you get a much higher level of insight. It's quite interesting.
Lasse, you were shaking your head yes. Did you want to add something?
No, I think it's great points being made. Maybe one thing in speaking about difference between interacting with HCPs. I was in medical affairs for some years, and now in patient engagement. I mean, I think to Daniel's point, I completely agree. I never had any experiences like that, negative experiences. Quite on the opposite side, it is extremely trust-based, but also I think, yeah, as long as I was mentioning before, you are very clear on that the relationship is balanced, is even. That is an important element. The mutual respect should be there. That will create the trust, because we have to remember that this is personal stories, and somewhat being delicate and understanding the handling there is important. So I think the co-creation element is absolutely vital, and then the balanced relationship. Because we can look at the history and say, well, HCP, specialist, pharma, academic, and so forth, and it's only the reason what 20-25 years that patients has been part of that, maybe a little bit longer back with certain diseases, right? And that's important to remember. So the mutual respect, the mutual balance relation is extremely important.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And actually, a little technique we've learned to help build that trust. Another one is we actually, after a face-to-face advisory board, you'll share the write-up, or virtual advisory board, you'll share the write-up with the same participants online, digitally, text-based. And then also, we often save the very, very last question of an advisory board to share the report with them. So you go back to them with a report and you say, look, this is what we think you've said, and this is what we think we should do with it. What do you think? Yeah. And sometimes that very final question is a brilliant way, because then they see the output. They learn that you really are listening, that you really do care, and also they can go on and see what you're intending to do with it.
That is what I mentioned with dialogue. I believe you cannot just say, thank you for the data, thank you for the insight, because that's market research and another ballgame. I think what we're talking here about with engagement is to say, you're sitting here next to us at the table, and what we want to do is what Lasse said, is co-create the solution. And co-create the solution is, when I make my draft based on what you all said, I need to go back with that draft. And maybe I say, this is it because I can't change it any further. That's fine, but at least you need to be clear there. And if you don't come back, I think it's a one-way direction communication, and that's not building trust, which is again what Mark also said in the beginning is key.
This continuous engagement component.
And
go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, and I just want to add in, I think we're all talking about the trust, and very much whether it's the patients or the healthcare professionals in that setting. I think just for a moment, just take it a little bit wider as well. It's obviously within the corporation and the regulators and governance and legal and all of those things. This is a bit of a change in terms of going from face-to-face to digital or more ongoing engagement. And I think we've all sort of loosely mentioned some sort of fears or concerns or worries of it being exploited or used in the wrong way. So long as we also keep that high engagement around the objective, we've all got approval mechanisms that we have to follow and constantly look at those. I think that goes equally as sort of important to make sure we've got that level of trust throughout.
So Felix, what's on the horizon? What is in our future, digitally speaking?
Well, one of the nice things is we might be able to see people face to face again, so let's not rule that out. But I mean, you can see how, I mean, if you've got Microsoft Teams on your computer, you can see how much people are investing in these technologies. These technologies are improving, but they're, people are getting more familiar with them. So it's going to become more and more normal for us to do this. And I think the pandemic has accelerated what was happening anyway. But this year we've just seen people turn around and go, oh wow, digital works. It works. And we're going, yeah, we've known that for years, but we've been unable to persuade people because they've been hanging on to the kind of traditional methods. But now they've had to give up the traditional methods. They're learning. But digital doesn't replace the traditional methods. Seeing people is nice. And seeing people, you get a different type of interaction that's better than on video calls. And we mustn't forget that. So for me, digital is always going to be a complement that's going to enhance the real world. It can replace it for a bit, but you want to kind of meet up at a conference, or you want to, go and have an advisory board and go out to dinner with people afterwards. But then digital can be this kind of glue that really cleverly kind of skips along the surface, that glues things together over time and brings a whole other dimension and a whole other level to the insight you can collect and the interactions you can have and the relationships you can build. And thinking of it as a genuine interaction, I think it can really transform things. So I'm looking forward to continuing to evolve the technologies and improve them, but also to find out how to get insight in a much more kind of seamless way alongside interactions, to enable people to really make decisions with the right information.
So it sounds like one of the components of a toolkit for advisory boards in the modern age is this blended approach, to the degree that we're allowed to do that from a pandemic perspective. But leaving that aside, the more we can blend these modalities together, the richer the data, the richer the insights, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Mark.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think it was funny, obviously, that you asked what was up and coming, or what was the future around digital. We mentioned face-to-face in that sense, but I think there's a case of we're going to have to do more quicker and faster in that sense. We have to we're still playing catch up, but also the generations of patients and healthcare professionals that are coming in, you know, the comfort of digital interactivity is there. So that's gonna have to happen. We're gonna have to meet that sort of new demand as it comes. So the sooner we start, or the more we do, the more experienced around the outskirts of that process. So how do we deal with the trust? How do we deal with the data? How do we share all of that? The more we can learn and get those processes really embedded will just help us for the future.
Yeah, this is such an important point about the generations that are coming, the KOLs that are coming up, and the patient leaders that are coming up, being so much more digitally savvy already. And not being pushed by a pandemic, but being pushed by their generational trends. Yeah. It's a really important point.
And Gabrielle, just to add, and apologies to jump in again, but
not at all.
One of the sessions yesterday, Paul Sims mentioned a company called Lemonade in the US, and it was a surprise to me. I had to look them up, but they're an insurance company in the US that had really sort of disruption, and disruption is a favorable word in that sense. You know, if we want to make change or do something different, let's try and disrupt the space. But what Lemonade have done is this sort of transparency thing and trust with their customers. And what the model that they were doing was, you pay for your insurance, but if there was money left over, that went to charity. And so then the change of people's behaviors, that rather than sort of making a claim and taking all the money, they knew that if they were giving or keeping money in, it was more going to charity. And just that connection really changed a lot of the behaviours. I'm not saying that's the, insurance and pharma, I suppose, lockdown sort of similarities in that sense. But it is, I think, how we look at those disruptive technologies. But it underpins that human behaviour. If we let go of that, then we sort of miss the whole point, and it becomes about the technology, not about the people.
What I hear you saying is that having an underlying purpose, a greater purpose, was motivating for people to participate. Yeah.
But that is, again, yes, I think in the beginning, we said we need to have people understand that what we're building is a better healthcare. It's better health outcomes, but better health outcomes also make that it is more sustainable. So it's a better healthcare. The patient needs to understand that what he or she, a person living with a condition, can say what I'm sharing is going to build the better environment for me and all the people who come after me. So that purpose is there. I think what's happened is some people have probably interest in slicing and dicing it, so that seems like it's all different parties not working together, but that's not how it should be.
Are there other big picture purposes that you think about, that you think we're serving through an advisory board approach, Felix? Other purposes?
Absolutely. I think we've talked about the patient advisory boards, but I think patients coming in to give advice, to a big company that's developing a £1 billion medicine, they definitely, in my experience, feel a big responsibility there. They really want to give the best advice to make sure the medicine is the best possible, delivered in the right way, the best possible dosage regimen, the best possible, everything, the best possible data, so it's as safe as possible. And they really bring that responsibility to the table, which means you get phenomenal insight. And so actually advisory boards are normally really, they are a good purpose. They are a positive thing. And that's really nice. It's a really great way to collaborate and work with external stakeholders, because you're not just pushing advertising at them, which can be seen as a negative. You know, you're actually partnering with them, and if you do it in the right way, it's phenomenally powerful.
So go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, just slightly changing, another area we're seeing is a combination of data. So, you know, we're talking a lot about advisory boards now, but we're also obviously collecting insight in many different ways, you know, doing face-to-face interviews or one-to-one interviews, doing desk research, looking online, doing expert identification to identify who's talking about what and who's expert in different topics. And when you start combining it with a wealth of other digital data out there, kind of coming back to a question about what's going to happen in the future, I think you then start ending up with a very, very powerful combination. So it's not just about the answers to the questions in the advisory board, it's about the context within which they're being given. And you can use that context to enrich the questions you ask, but also to understand them better.
So we have healthcare improvement as a purpose. We have learning as a purpose. Mark, what would you add to the list of why we do advisory board activities?
Well, I think I'd double up on the one of learning, because I think that is that's special. I think even for this, I mean, we've all come together as a group of panelists here, and you know, experts in that sense. But I've even learned 2 or 3 things today, and just the sort of different things around having that discussion. And you know, Lasse mentioned about the point of actually the people running the advisory board having more time to reflect and change the questions. And I'll be honest, that's a sort of a benefit that I hadn't quite come to realise or see in the same way. So I think learning, absolutely brilliant. I think we need to, and I love the way of Daniel saying it is about better healthcare, and having that sort of ambition, that purpose in mind is always key. If we know we're on there and that's our North Star, and we're transparent and we build that trust, then we're always on that good line to improvement, and keeping communication, keeping collaborating is the best thing.
And Lasse, for you, higher purpose around advisory?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot has been said already, but I think a clear higher purpose is, to everyone's point here today, to make the optimal or the best solutions for people living with chronic diseases in our case. Being it that we use, as you say, the virtual advisory boards and different channels. I mean, what's most important is, in the end, do we have a solution for a person living with X disease? And is that the optimal solution? And keep working towards that. And I agree to Daniel. I mean, this is not the topic for today, but an important point was made earlier. It's not only about a collaboration between pharma HCPs or pharma and patients. We have to bring everyone in. So it means that it is both academia, it is the patient environment, it is HTA bodies, it's the authorities, it's pharma, it's everyone that we need to bring together. And that's an important mission. And I think we have many initiatives doing that. David, you mentioned YouPatty yourself, an absolutely fantastic initiative, again, being focused very much on educating patients to bring them up to that balanced level with, for example, pharma or authorities. So I think that overall purpose is super important also as well.
Great. So in our last 2 minutes, we'll just go quickly around the room. And if you could share one piece of advice that you have for our participants today in terms of going digital, being digital, and gathering insights and feedback from particular groups. Daniel, one piece of feedback, or one piece of advice rather.
I would say they're doing it daring, because many people will fluster in your ears that it can't be done, it shouldn't be done, it's risky, whatever. The list is endless, but that should not stop you from doing it, and convince the others that this can be done in a compliant way. So just go for it.
That's great. Mark, piece of advice?
Yeah, I think, look, we're talking about digital and technology, but I think it's important to say people first, technology second. So if you focus on the people, then you'll get that flow nicely.
That's great. Lasse?
Well, Mark took my words there, but again, yes, remember why we're doing all of this. As I said before, two different media, yes, but remember it's actually for the people living with this disease, caregivers or someone affected to their family. So I think that's the most important aspect here. But concretely around the advisory boards, around the digital space, I think an element of purpose, outlining, you could say, the clear mission behind it, being very concrete in saying what is the outcome here, why are people here, so they understand, but also being very transparent in terms of have your framework in place so there's full transparency, and then the follow-up, as I mentioned afterwards, be very clear on how you will use those insights, what you can't use, what you can use, and so forth. I think those are some of the elements I think are important on top of what we have been discussing, and encouragement to everyone living with a condition. I mean, reach out. There is definitely a way to work, especially now to the digital space as well. And as Daniel said, dare to reach out and push for closer collaboration, to have a say, to have a voice in what's actually coming out as in terms of solutions. So I think that is what I will leave people with.
All right, Felix, our closing comment.
Yeah, I think doing them over time is really important. You know, so you can get the insights alongside your normal activities in this blended approach we're talking about. So you can make decisions with this advisory board and build that relationship.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our participants and to all of our panelists. And with that, I will hand it back to Dario.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. Thank you, gentlemen, for this very interesting discussion. I would just like to mention a couple of things. First, that the session itself will be available next week on our official YouTube channel. And also, I would like to invite you for our second session of today, which is coming at 3 p.m. Central Europe time, related to conversational AI. Definitely very interesting team, so feel free to join. And of course, we are seeing you in the rest of the 3 days from tomorrow till Friday. Hope you enjoyed, same as we did, and wish all the best. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.